Hello, my true crime chocoholics. Welcome back. There are some new updates in the Mica Miller case that I think you might find interesting. If you're not familiar with the case, we're going to cover it today. We had a poll. I put up 4 different cases for feedback on what you guys are interested in, and the Lafferty brothers under the banner of Heaven story won. So I'm doing a deep dive on that very soon, so stay tuned to that. If you are new, welcome to True Crime, Faith, and Chocolate. I'm your host, Annette Lyon, USA Today bestselling author of the suspense novel Just One More and a whole bunch of other stuff. I'm also a woman of faith, chocoholic, true crime junkie, which is why we are here. Mica Miller, her case is very unusual. Like many that I cover, it does deal with religion, but not Latter-day Saints, which is mine. So that's nice to have a different faith for once. The interesting thing with Mica Miller's situation is that her death was ruled self-inflicted, but there is so much swirling around the circumstances and the history what led up to it, and if her husband J.P. John Paul, pastor J.P. Miller, was somehow involved. And that it gets dicey, guys. It gets very crazy and dicey. So here we're going to do kind of overview of what led up to her death, what happened that we think we know, some history, some questionable stuff going on. That's what we're talking about today. And the latest updates, which you'll want to hear. The sad, tragic end was a Mica Miller, age 30. She passed away on April 27th of 2024. She was seen shortly before on security cameras purchasing a firearm at a pawn shop, as well as ammo to go with it. And then sometime later on the same day, she made a 911 phone call. She basically is saying, can you track my phone, find my location, because I want my family to know where to find me, because I'm going to do this to myself. And of course, the dispatcher is trying to keep her on the line and fails, and her body was found shortly after. I'm going to jump back and forth through a lot of different things because there's so many pieces of the puzzle that are just bizarre. So trying to tell the whole thing chronologically is difficult. JP, again, her husband, John Paul, again, pastor, he had a really wild interview that he did on Banfield, if you know Ashley Banfield's show, with reporter Rich McHugh, who was a fantastic interviewer. They took the entire episode. I highly recommend watching that. I'll link to it. A couple of highlights I'll be pointing out throughout. JP claims, he just makes a lot of weird claims that don't make sense. He claims that prior to her passing, she had told a friend that if she ever were to do this to herself, that she would do so at this particular state park, Lumber River State Park, and that is where it happened. However, we know she'd never been there. He had never been there. In this interview with Richard McHugh, he claims that, she picked that area because she loves the outdoors, she loves nature, and that's where she would do it. But even in the interview, he admitted she'd never been there. Doesn't make sense. And her body was found in an area that they said would be hard to go to if you didn't know it. Like over this kind of secluded area. It also looks like she would have had to wade through possibly waist-deep water to get there. Kind of an unusual thing. And the 911 call, there is no sound at all except for her voice. There's no water. There's no leaves. She's not walking on any ground, gravel. There are no birds. There's no scurrying other animals. There's no sound except for her voice. Except, here's another little, if you want to go conspiracy theory on this, it was kind of wild. There was a TikToker who works in radio and has a background using sound technologies, took the 911 call and tried to jack up the sound in certain parts, and it kind of sounded like possibly maybe there's a voice whispering to her, potentially. Her family does not believe that she did this to herself. They are firmly convinced it was a setup, that JP was involved, and that it was set up to look like she had done this to herself. More details about that later. Her belongings, a bag of hers and some other belongings, were found on the shore with spent casings, multiple spent casings, and her body was found in farther in a different spot of the water. This is stagnant water, but when it does move at all, it moves in the direction her body would have been in the other direction. You would think if her body had floated away from the casings. But also, how you're holding a firearm to your cranium, how do you pull the trigger more than once? That doesn't make sense. And she was trained. She knew how to use a firearm. There were 2 fishermen in the area who both reported hearing someone crying. And then they heard a shot. That doesn't sound like a voluntary situation to me. In the 911 call, her voice was very calm, very collected. Her father later said it sounded slow and not like her. So he wonders, was she drugged? Was it actually AI that JP had used something to develop a recording of what maybe her voice would sound like and managed to mimic it in the call? Who knows? But it is odd. There are a lot of just weird things that just don't seem to quite add up. So one of the fishermen actually found her belongings and then also found her body. And he later took Rich McHugh to that area and he said, yeah, would be hard to find on your own. And again, you'd have to wade through the water, all of that weird stuff. Her passing was very quickly ruled self-inflicted. Trying to use words that were safe for the platform. Something that Rich McHugh mentions after the fact with this interview, he says that the JP is constantly rubbing his face, especially his nose. He's constantly rubbing his nose throughout. At times in the interview, he actually looks somewhat manic.
Oh, that's a great question. Man, that's such a good question. Wow, what a good question. Can I have a second to think about it? Like, oh, man. I know what I do. Drugs?
Hallucinogenic drugs, yeah.
Oh, I've never done a legal drug my whole life.
Okay.
Well, oh, crap, that was a lie. I'm sorry, that was a lie.
Sometimes he's contradicting himself. Sometimes he's just not even making sense. It was a bizarre interview. That's the day she passed. A couple of things, important things that happened before that. It was a Saturday that she passed. 2 days before that, on Thursday, JP was served with divorce papers for the second time. She served them the previous fall, I believe October. They had been in the works for some time. They'd been separated for months. He had been trying to reconcile and she said absolutely not. There's just been too much of, she said, every kind you can imagine. She, depending on if you're talking to her lawyer or her sister, she listed sexual, physical, psychological, financial, every kind you can possibly imagine. And so that's suspicious. Thursday, she serves papers. Saturday, she passes. Sunday, not 24 hours after her passing, JP gives the most bizarre sermon. And yes, he gave a sermon. And in his interview with Rich McHugh, he's like, oh my goodness, people say that was weird, but I don't know how are you supposed to react? If someone should tell me, are you a psychologist? Tell me how I should have acted. Like, maybe like a grieving husband. I don't know. He tells the congregation, don't stay after. We're not going to do, I guess that they have some after service thing that they would normally do. We're not doing that today. I have an announcement to make. I'm going to ask you all to leave as soon as I've made this announcement. Do not talk amongst each other. Just leave. Okay. And then he says that she has passed. She did it to herself and basically throws her under the bus. It was odd. There was multiple memorials. Her family had one. He had his own for her at the church. And in his eulogy at the memorial, very odd, he says things like how good looking and hot she was. She won beauty pageants. And he actually said, quote, imagine being married to that. Objectifying much? Creepy. At one point he said that he had curled up next to her, he lay next to her dead body and was crying. And then later in his interview with Rich McHugh, he says, oh, well, I couldn't actually, it wasn't on the table because wasn't room for that in the morgue, but I leaned over and hugged her and then I sat on the floor and cried. Whatever, dude. Tried to raise her from the dead, as one does. And then he said later he thought he did raise her from the dead. He saw someone that from the back he thought was Mica. And no, it was her sister, because he's sane. The obituary that he wrote for her, that's also a bit disturbing, in my opinion. There's an entire paragraph that basically is eulogizing him, which you find in that interview with Rich McHugh. So much of it is I this and I that, and his sermon he gave the day after, I this. It's all about him, how much he's suffering, how sad he is, and then how she did this to herself and her family's to blame. Here's a little snippet of the obituary that he wrote. So how it said that she was an amazing wife. She helped Pastor JP with the church in every way. Mica was the worship leader, graphics designer, youth leader, women's and she did all of this with the utmost. This is the editor in me. I get a little catty when someone is I think is a bad person and they use grammar wrong. Utmost, not to upmost. You do this, but with the utmost integrity and faithfulness. Here's where it gets. Ugh. Mica made the greatest of efforts to always be the best wife she could be. She truly served Jesus and her husband with all her heart. She would praise her husband after every church service, telling him he was the best preacher in the world. She also told him he was the funniest preacher in the world, making even her obituary about him. So if we didn't think he was already kind of a self-centered, egotistical dirtbag, we learn a lot of really creepy things about his history. She met him about 15 years old. I've seen 14 reported in some places, 15 in others. We'll say 15, regardless, underage. He was married and had kids. They had an affair. So that's cute. The affair was not when she was 15, but she was part of the youth group in the church, and he was obviously the pastor, and so there was a relationship. And in my opinion, I have no proof of this. This is just an opinion. It sounds very groomy. Prior to age 18, I suspect that there was grooming going on. I think they eventually have an affair. His wife divorces him. Somewhere in there, Mica was married and divorced as well. Allie, his first wife, had actually taken Mica in. Mica had babysat her kids. Mica didn't really have a mother figure, so Allie said that she kind of took on this mother role. And then suddenly, this young woman has had an affair with her husband, and it's her children's stepmother. And yet, from everything I have gathered, Allie just was an absolute class act. Recognized that Mica was a victim in all of this, didn't blame her, and actually at the end of things was trying to help Mica escape the marriage. Mica came to her and said, help me. Do you have a counselor I can go to? Do you have any resources? Can you help me get out of this? Because clearly Allie had successfully gotten out, and Mica wanted to get out too. Allie says that he had been as well. There's a history. An ex-girlfriend has also come forward since all of this, saying that when she was 14 and JP was 19, they dated for a year. And she says at the time of being 14, she didn't think much of it, but at 19, he should have. And she thought back to that and thought, wow, that was a creepy thing for him to be dating a 14-year-old. And then she found out when they were dating, he was also dating his future wife, Allie. They got married in 2018. And then she died at age 30. So it sounds like she was 24-ish when they were married. He claims she's mentally ill, always has been. Then it got worse when her family would get involved because they would try to take her off medications. They didn't support her, didn't want her on medications. They wouldn't let her go home to him when she separated finally. And her family says she never had any mental illness issues until she married him. And this seems like, to me, a very common pattern where we see women who end up with depression or a panic issue or whatever it is when they're in a abusive relationship. Think Tammy Daybell. Yeah, was she on antidepressants? And shocker, she had a jerk of a husband. So if Mica developed a mental illness, I would blame him. But there's evidence that he's the one who had mental illness for quite some time. Now, the months leading up to all of these events in April, he was blocking her from her iCloud. He would delete files from her email, from her phone, from her laptop, from Facebook. He would go on to Facebook and pretend to be her. I suspect there could be charges pending on that kind of thing, impersonating somebody, and I don't know what all they could charge him on, but to me that seems there's charge-worthy things there, I suspect. He also was tracking her. There was GPS trackers on his car. He denies that in the Rich McHugh interview, and then kind of backtracks and says, well, PI did it. But yeah, he had hired. But then he says he stopped paying for the PI because what was the point, and he ran out of money, and then 3 weeks later she passed. The PI was supposed to be tracking her so she couldn't buy a firearm, and he just conveniently, he's sure that she's going to hurt herself, and somehow he doesn't keep paying for the PI. Okay, dude. He also slashed her tires twice. And then the second time, the cops actually found a GPS tracker on her car. He would email and text and call and otherwise harass and stalk. The way he puts it is that I would try every day to save her life because I just knew. So I would email her and I would do these things 3 or 4 times a day, at least one thing a day to try to save her life. But as he's describing it, I'm like, that sounds like stalking and harassing to me, especially when she has left and said, I'm serving you papers. Dude, go away. He's also inconsistent with what he describes her mental illness as. In most places, I've seen him describe it as schizophrenia, which would track with him saying that she's supposed to be on lithium. Elsewhere, he says she's bipolar, but his behavior looks more schizophrenic or bipolar. Those are very different illnesses, but the erratic nature, the mania or paranoia he seems to exhibit could be symptoms, in my opinion. Not a psychologist or psychiatrist, that he's the one who's having some delusions or manic episodes. Regardless, he fully blames Mica's family for her death, which is disgusting on so many levels. When she would flee to her sister's house, trying to escape him, and then he would call and say, I'm waiting outside your house with a gun. I mean, oh yeah, he was really concerned about her, sure. Dude, she told law enforcement during this time that she feared for her life. He sent an email to her that they have where he apologizes for the tires, for tracking, and for posting a topless picture of her online. He also says at that point that, well, I only put it up for an hour, so as if that's no harm done. It's on the internet. It's gonna, I mean, hi, especially that kind of picture. Someone has it and is probably still out there and will be forever. But he says he only did it because he wanted to hurt her. Oh, well, in that case, like, dude, what? He's like, oh, no, that was all fake. I never did any of those things. I was fake apologizing because she was so delusional. She thought I'd done these things. I figured if I apologized for things I never did, I could lure her home and make sure she took her medicine. Because that makes sense. He threatened to do all kinds of things, to lock her out of the house. He threw out her belongings. He cheated on her many times, including the day she passed. In fact, with Susie, this is a creepy thing. That particular mistress was married, and her husband he used a wheelchair, and the husband had gone to JP and said, lay off my wife, stay out of my marriage. And then, surprise, surprise, very soon after that confrontation, her husband accidentally falls into a swimming pool in his wheelchair and dies of drowning. That's not at all suspicious. What? So there's a lot of creepy things surrounding JP. I don't know if there's evidence to charge him with anything, but it just seems like, you know what, this is not a dude to want to hang around. The JP was trying to move his assets around, like put their house in the name of the church, give the car to somebody else, whatever, so that she wouldn't have assets if and when she managed to complete the paperwork and actually dissolve the marriage. So in February, prior to her death at the end of April, he managed to get her involuntarily committed in a mental hospital. And he's putting some of her things into an apartment of someone named Diana. The documents he was trying to get rid of, they say, have lots of evidence of abuse, his affairs, and that he was paying off people and or blackmailing them for various things. Apparently, he also showed paperwork to her father when he was getting her committed, saying that he had power of attorney over her for medical things and anything else. Now, her dad now is looking back in hindsight saying, I don't know if those papers were actually completed and notarized and official. They could have been fake for all we know. And so, you know, take that for what it's worth. I'm not making accusations, just throwing out what people have observed and thought. So in March, moving forward a little bit here, this is after her involuntary commitment, he gives more bizarre sermons. Again, throwing her under the bus about her mental health, talks about, he's preaching about going to find a hot wife, how divorce is wrong, keeping in mind he's already been divorced himself once, how she emptied out their bank accounts, which is absolute falsehood from what I understand. Also in March, Mica posts a couple of videos to Facebook. And one of them, she says, she wants to let you guys know, which actually says, I want to let you all know I'm alive, which generally that would sound like a, hi, I'm here, you know, I'm fine. Checking in, I haven't been on for a while, but in hindsight, it's a little creepy. I mean, she goes, oh, like she knew maybe, because she was scared for her life. In her first video, she says that, just know that I have to keep my circle small right now because of things I'm going through, but I love you all. About that same time, JP, who had put in a request to the court to get spousal support from Mica. He's the pastor of the church. She's the one who works for him, basically. Okay. But the court denied his request. And then later in the month, Mica makes a second video. And this is when she doesn't say outright, but she kind of implies, again, my opinion, and many others share this opinion, but in the second video, it sounds like she is saying that she has been the victim of all of these different kinds of abuse, including being drugged and having all of the different kinds of stuff happen to her, and saying that yes, God does not like divorce, but why? And that God hates divorce because it hurts people. But you know what else hurts people? Is abuse. And it's okay to leave that kind of situation because we matter as individuals. Like we are the bride of Christ, as his way she put it. And think of a righteous man, how he would want his bride treated. That's how God would view us. April 16th, Mica then files for spousal support. A few days later, they have a court date is set for June about that request, but it never happens, of course, because a few days after that, she's found passed. Shortly after all of this goes down, Allie, the ex-wife, she files a petition with the court, an emergency request to get full custody so that JP cannot have the kids. And she gives all kinds of really disturbing evidence about why JP should not be with the kids. Things he has said around the kids, things he has done around the kids, including having mistresses around. One time saying, oh, Mica's crazy, and then suddenly she's back and, oh, never mind, she's fine. So the kids just never know what's up and what's down, that he is a danger, on and on and on. Mentioned Susie and her husband's situation. I mean, it's wild, but that is granted. The court can recognize that there's a lot of weird stuff going on. So in abundance of caution, for the sake of the children, let's just keep them safe. After, I think it's been a couple of months since her passing, in the summer sometime, he has his lawyers put out this whole statement where he threatens to sue and basically destroy anyone and any media organization or company or whatever who reports on the case and essentially does not say nice things about him. Forget free speech and all of that. No, he's calling out libel and whatever else. But you know what, dude? We can report facts and we can report opinions. That's the law. Other weird things that we've learned, though, that, again, these are factual information. Neighbors report that he would walk around the neighborhood in a Spider-Man costume. When asked about it by Richard McHugh, he's like, I will neither confirm nor deny that I've ever worn a Spider-Man costume. But I will say this, you'll never see me and Spider-Man in the same room at the same time. Are you 9? Then he tries to explain, we used to do cosplay and go to Comic-Con type things, which, okay, that would make sense, but not skulking around your neighborhood as Spider-Man by yourself. That's not the same thing. If you've been to Comic-Con, that's a cool experience. Not the same thing, dude. We also learned that in 1999, he had a conviction, mind you, this is not just a charge or a rumor, this is a conviction, for assault for hitting a woman 2 times with his vehicle and then dragging her down the street. That gave me some creepy vibes about another recent case. Wade Wilson, anybody? Yeah, that's creepy. And then also there's some video that has surfaced of him shortly after his divorce with Allie, where he just looks drugged out of his mind.
It's biting everywhere.
Is your medication something they gave you?
I mean, for viewers, for people watching it, the common thought is, what is going on here, and do you have a drug problem?
In the, again, interview with Richmond Q, he claims, oh, I had fallen out of a tree and broken a bunch of bones. And so that day I'd taken too much pain medication, and I had never been on pain medication before. And that's why he was acting weird. Basically, crying like a baby on the grass. Like I've seen people on pain medication, and even when they're kind of this weird little high, they're not doing that. Like I don't, Percocet's not doing that, guys. That's not, no. And then McHugh actually asks him, have you ever done illegal drugs? And he goes, no. Then he goes, oh, this is one of the weird manic moments.
And I was on pain meds, and it just all went together. I fell out of a tree, broke a bunch of bones, took too many pain meds. That was that story.
Not hallucinogenics.
Not, what would hallucinogenic be?
Make you hallucinate.
Well, what makes you hallucinate?
Drugs.
Like illegal drugs?
Hallucinogenic drugs, yeah.
Oh, I've never done a legal drug my whole life.
Okay.
Well, oh crap, that was a lie. I'm sorry, that was a lie. When I was 16 years old, one time I was in a truck with two of my friends, and they were both smoking pot. I didn't smoke any, but they do a thing called hot box, and so I got some of that. And I tried steroids one time.
No, I lied. I'm sorry, I lied. As if that was the only time he's been lying. And he says, well, I was around people who were smoking marijuana, so I must have inhaled some of that, which feels like a little like Bill Clinton. I never inhaled. And then also I used steroids once. Meanwhile, Micah's sister is saying, no, the family has proof that he has used illegal drugs and steroids multiple times. They know this for a fact, which is, not a surprise. I have not seen the proof. This is what her sister has said. Something else I noted with the interview, and if you watch the whole thing, his facial expressions do not look normal for someone experiencing grief. Usually you'll find the eyebrows moving, like you're coming in, and the creases on your forehead. And sometimes you even get like these muscles that are clustering together, almost like in a horseshoe shape. You don't see that at all with him. Like for the first several minutes of the interview, there was no movement of his forehead at all. And I thought, I wonder if he's had Botox, because it was that flat. Later in the interview, his eyebrows are moving around, and you see little wrinkles of his forehead moving. So I'm like, oh, so he can move his forehead. He just wasn't when he was supposedly grieving over his dead wife. And then also, it's a little harder to see because he's got a little bit of a beard, and he's constantly rubbing his beard and his nose and all that. But when you're upset and crying, often your chin will quiver and move. And if you watch the video I did about Colby Ryan when he was interviewing his mom, Lori Vallow, I pointed that out. There's a moment where his chin is just quivering. You can tell that is genuine grief and sadness, and just he's so upset and he's trying to hold it in. You don't see anything remotely like that with JP. There are moments where he might have actual tears, but he's also like pressing his fingers into his eyes so hard he could be making his eyes water. It's hard to know for sure, but regardless, in my opinion, his crying looks incredibly fake. And there's video of him crying as he's giving sermons, and it looks just the same. And I'm sorry, if you're giving a sermon and you're telling a touching story and you cry about it, that should look different from how you look when you're crying over the self-inflicted death, supposedly, of your wife. Call me crazy. In my opinion, that seems odd. Things that her father has said since all of this, because the family wants a bigger investigation, and the FBI has stepped in. The local county have reached out to the FBI and asked for help. So they have expanded the investigation. They say the JP rushed the cremation process. There was an autopsy, but toxicology, I think they just ran like alcohol levels. With toxicology, that's the tricky part with autopsies, is that you have to know exactly what you're testing, because there's so many possible things you could test. And that's actually why I personally think that, like in the Alex Cox situation, why it was deemed natural causes. I think he was killed with some sort of poison, but they didn't know what to test. And they didn't test for whatever it was that got him, in my opinion. But they didn't test for a whole bunch of things. Who knows? It sounds like a very relatively small panel, and then he even got her cremated. So there's no going back even. As I said before, her dad says that it doesn't sound like her voice in the 911 call. So it sounds like maybe she was potentially drugged, or maybe it was AI generated. Then he points out that she had bruises and scratches that were unexplained, and particularly bruises on one hand. And he and her mother theorize that if you had grabbed her hand around a firearm and held it up in the position that would make it look as if she had done this self-inflicted, and she was trying to fight back, that's where the bruises on her hand would end up. And there were also scratches, and he kind of mimes like this, like going from elbow to fingers, that direction. He said, and then other scratches on her hands that he feels are defensive, fighting back marks. And he asked the coroner, and the coroner, I guess the coroner in training, who was there at the viewing, about those, and they didn't even address them, I guess, in the autopsy. Coroner in training said, well, maybe those scratches came about when her body was taken out of the water. And he said, okay, but that doesn't make sense, because in that area there weren't trees and like limbs that would just be scratching anything. That doesn't make sense. What would have been scratching her? So he's thinking the fact that there were multiple casings, the scratching, the bruises, and that she's crying. They heard her, 2 people, ear witnesses, heard her crying before the shots. They think it's suspicious enough, and maybe someone was there. And on the AI bit, her dad says he didn't elaborate in this particular interview, but he said that the JP does have a history of using AI and mimicking voices. I wonder what that's about. I would love to know more. Now, JP supposedly has an alibi. He was an hour or 2 north, I think, at a soccer game with his kids and his latest mistress, supposedly. However, he claims that there were tons of people at the soccer game, which I'm like, oh, that's appropriate with bringing your mistress, but okay. Her father then says, we're not sure that anyone actually saw him. There are pictures of his truck up there, but the truck has dark tinted windows. You can't see inside that he's the one driving it. And that at the scene of the crime, or not, whatever it is, the police did not search her car for a tracking device, even though the one had been found before. And they were like, oh, there wasn't one. He goes, well, did you look for one? Well, no. And he says, well, one could have been on there and then removed. He could have been tracking her and then knew where to find her, or who knows? We don't really know what's going on. Then, of course, there's the stagnant water situation. Mica's sister has shown video of the 2 spots. Like, this is where her belongings were found and the casings were found, and way over here is where she was found. It doesn't make sense with the stagnant water, and even if there was flow, it'd go the other direction. Now, all of that craziness, that's a lot, leads up to November 2024, some of our latest updates. He's been arrested. He now has charges of assault because there are now protests in front of the church regularly. I believe every Sunday, and then several days during the week, people are out there protesting because they want justice for Mica. They think that he either pressured her into doing this to herself, or that someone was there, whether it was him or someone else, somehow forced, so it looked like it was self-inflicted, something, that he threatened her or whatever it was, that he was somehow involved in making this happen. The church is going to get closed down. It's being emptied out. At one point, a protester was mad, understandably, and followed him into a parking lot from the church. And her lawyers, I love her, she was like, I'm sure his lawyer is going, no, don't do that. The first thing you do is like, do not react. Don't reply. Don't say a word. You turn around and you walk away. But he replied. He turned around, and I can't remember the word they used, but essentially he hit this woman with his cell phone. It doesn't sound like it was particularly violent, but it was enough to warrant a charge of assault. I also suspect he may face charges, again, for things like impersonating her, but also possibly for fraud with money issues. Her lawyer, her divorce lawyer, had said that if people had donated money to the church and it had been earmarked for something specific, like say for the school he claimed to be building in Africa, and the money didn't go to that could be considered fraud. If it was just a general donation to the church, that would be different. But if it was like, oh, this is the money I'm donating to this particular cause, and he just pocketed it, then he may have more charges. And he might, because if he's hurting for money, which I imagine he probably is. Who knows? I don't know. Again, opinions, guesses. But Mica's divorce attorney has said that she had a subpoena for a grand jury and had evidence she needed to turn over. Of course, she cannot say what she said at the grand jury, what she testified to, or what evidence she handed over. But says she seemed to imply that there was some pretty hefty evidence there. And she would love to see what was on Mica's telephone, all of the messages and the emails and the harassment that she believes was on there. But we won't see that for some time because the FBI has her phone and all that for right now. So we shall see. So I don't think he's behind bars. I'm pretty sure he's out on bail, but he was arrested on charges of assaulting a protester, which is just ironic. But to me, there are enough really bizarre things going on with his background, his mental health, his history of absolute cheating, his ex-wife's, her statements to the court about some of his deviancy that this man is unwell, in my opinion. And it's a cautionary tale, if nothing else, that poor Mica, poor Mica, she deserves to be here. She deserves so much. She did not deserve what happened to her for years. Sounds like she was trying to get out for years. And JP made sure that didn't happen, whether he was directly responsible or just peripherally responsible. I don't know that we'll ever know for sure. But kind of like Al Capone was finally put behind bars because of tax evasion, and because everybody knew he was a mobster and he was responsible for all of these other crimes, but they just couldn't 100% prove those crimes in court. I wonder, will JP end up behind bars in a cell for fraud, for impersonating her, for false imprisonment, for threats, for who knows what all they could possibly charge him with. A lot, I suspect. It wouldn't be full justice because it wouldn't be under the banner of you did this to Mica. But it would be something if he ends up behind bars. It'd be the least she deserves. A little bit of justice. Thanks for tuning in. Stay tuned for the Lafferty case. That's a heavy one. That's a really, really big heavy one. We'll need a whole bunch of chocolate to get through that one. I'm going to go grab myself a little chocolate now because this has been a heavy one for me too. Have a good one. Take care of each other. Go get yourself something sweet.